the global relay. Bridge the Gap Fund is excited to talk to Jesse Korf about pathways. Jesse is currently the Executive General Manager of Performance at Australian Cycling. Between 2022 and 2024, he led a very successful overhaul of Australia's performance cycling programs. Jesse was previously Pathway Development Lead at both Cycling Canada and Australian Cycling. Under Jesse's guidance, Australia recently launched pathway reforms following a nationwide review and consultation process. Cycling has changed a lot in recent years. These changes have made it challenging for athletes, coaches, and parents to figure out what choices to make as they navigate the sport. This BTG conversation will be in two parts. Today we will speak with Jesse about pathways. On August 9th, we will follow up with a live Q&A where athletes, coaches, and parents can ask Jesse direct questions. Anyone interested in joining us? August 9th can register on the Global Relay Bridge, the GAP website. The link is in the video description.
Jesse, thanks so much for joining us today. You and I get to talk quite often, and it's a real pleasure to have you join the Bridge the Gap community and share some of your experience with all the young developing cyclists across the country.
Cheers, Kev. It's good to be on. Thanks for having me. Look forward to it. Should be fun having a bit of a chat with yourself and Leah. Looking forward to it. Yeah, so I think keen is a fair description. If you'd say avid or good, I'd probably question that. Certainly not as fast as some of the people on the call or people watching. But no, I'm a Dutch Canadian, or now get introduced as a Dutch Canadian Aussie. But yeah, grew up around bikes in the Netherlands. My dad was a cyclist, so he used to be around the races, ride a lot, go for training rides, go for a race here and there. So yeah, pretty much from as long as I can remember, really, been around a bike or bike races, even though I was never really any good myself and tended to do a little bit better in other sports. But yeah, been around the sport for ages, grew up with it, love working in it. Yeah. So I was a basketball player growing up and made it to pro in Europe. Had some injuries, cut a career relatively short, and transitioned to coaching. So I guess you can call it my professional journey started in basketball and coaching and trying to learn and explore and grow that muscle a little bit. And yeah, moved from coaching basketball to being involved in physiology and strength and conditioning and speed skating in the Netherlands for a while with a professional team. And for those that follow speed skating, in particular pro speed skating, you've got a lot of teams in the Netherlands, and they do about 60, well, depending on the year and the volume, but let's say between 50 and 70% of their training volume on a bike. That went pretty well. Got dragged over to cycling. So then worked out of the Benelux predominantly, covered Europe a bit more broadly in a bit of a blend of community coaching and then some physiology support for some of the pro teams with the brand that I was affiliated with at the time. And subsequently moved to Canada, worked out of Canada for a bit, did pathways, did a little bit with UCAF on strategy development, and then got recruited to Australia. So that's it. So I went from basketball to speed skating to cycling, and from the Netherlands to the US, back to the Netherlands to Canada to Australia. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's been a minute since I've been there. Couple reasons. We're obviously doing our homework for the LA Games, so. We're going to scope a couple of environments in Canada. First off, in Edmonton, for Olympic or Paralympic prep reasons, and get that dialed in. So we'll be there for a while, and then we'll be over in Victoria for a bit to do some further work, have some more conversations. Happy to engage with anybody on the ground there. and then jump across to Quebec for Road Worlds and be out of Montreal for a couple of weeks.
Awesome. So right now you're in the UK at the Commonwealth Games, correct?
Well, almost. In Wales, preparing for the Commonwealth Games. We're flying up to Glasgow tomorrow. Yeah, happy to connect with anyone in Edmonton and Victoria. Montreal, also happy, but it'd be a bit touch and go depending on team commitments and what the team needs.
I guess let's start with a little bit of the killer question. Jesse, how would you define a pathway in sport?
A pathway. Well, very convoluted question. People talk about it a lot, and then they typically refer to why it is or isn't great, or some kind of theoretical model that the government or academics like to use, like LTAD or FTEM or those kind of things. But a pathway, in essence, is pretty simple. And that is to say, if you've got an ambition or a dream, are the steps to getting there clearly articulated, and is that done in an organized fashion? If the answer to both of those are yes, you've got a pathway. If the answer to one or two of them is no, then you don't have a pathway. But even if you don't have a pathway, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, because there'll still be a lot of opportunities. And I think there's a lot, well, we certainly have a lot of discussion internally, but also academically, there's a bit more of a shift to having a pathway, which is kind of like owning the vertical. You do this first, then you have to do that, and you have to do that, kind of like school, as in you go to elementary school first, then you go to high school, then you go to uni, and then you may go to graduate school and you get a job. That's a pathway. That has been long proposed in sports, and cycling's no different. I think British cycling's probably the best exemplar in that. But there's more ways to get from point A to point B, and going to like an academy or a national style system or program isn't necessarily for everyone, and it isn't the only way to get there either. So I think the better way to talk about it is what does the ecosystem look like, and is the ecosystem viable and rich, and what are the opportunities there, and how can you look at either a pathway or an ecosystem and kind of figure out what works for you based on your ambitions and where you are in your journey.
And can you
Awesome.
maybe explain the difference between, so we have pathways, programs, and ecosystem?
Yeah. So if you have a pathway, you basically have a connection of programs. So for example, if we take the academic example that we just said, it's like you go to elementary school, then to high school, then to uni. For those countries and sports that do have a pathway, that is the same. It is pretty clear defined. You're going to this regional academy, and you're going to learn these skills and these behaviors, and you're going to develop this aptitude. And then if you're good enough, you may graduate and progress to a national academy, and from a national academy you may progress and graduate into an Olympic program or a pro team. That is pretty much a pathway. So you could say that's 3 joined programs. An ecosystem is basically the entire environment of options available to you, which consists of clubs. It may consist of some academies. It may consist of some entities that help support with camps and coach development and activities, like Bridge the Gap, for example. Part of an ecosystem, even though it's not necessarily an academy, but definitely contributes to a role. Continental teams, pro teams, development teams, national academies, national teams, they're all part of the entire ecosystem, or your tapestry of options and players. And sometimes you could go from a club and you're going to do races, and you may join a Conti team and you get some extra development through something like Bridge the Gap or another entity, and you go from there to a World Tour development team, and from a World Tour development team to a World Tour, and you may go from a World Tour team to a national team and then back to your World Tour team. Or you may also go from your club to some kind of a next-gen program, and from a next-gen program into an Olympic program. And there's different ways to get to that endpoint. It doesn't necessarily all have to be the same. So the collection of everything around you that you can tap into or that can help you in your development, that's the ecosystem. A pathway is a series of programs, if it exists, potentially within that ecosystem. And a program is just what one of those entities may do, as in Bridge the Gap may have a program. 94 Forward may have a program. Premier Tech might have a program in Canada. Cycling Canada may or may not have a program, whatever the case may be. So that's the difference.
Thanks for that explanation.
And we have been, with the work we do with Bridge the Gap, we've been sensing a little bit more, I'd say, uncertainty and then potentially anxiety with younger athletes and parents, because the sport has actually changed quite significantly just in the last 5 or 6 years. So what, in your opinion, could help we'll kind of take it in two parts. We'll talk about parents and athletes, or maybe 3, and then coaches. What makes a pathway coherent? And we'll start with young developing athletes.
Oh, great question. What makes a pathway coherent?
Or maybe let's shift the discussion from this point on and talk about the ecosystem. So how can a young athlete look at the ecosystem of the sport where they live and exist in their province or country or region, and sort of create coherence out of that ecosystem, like all the different parts?
Yeah, I think to start really simple and maybe kicking in an open door, making sure that you've got the opportunity to train enough, to race enough, and have really good coaching and support around you. Just from, by support, I mean encouraging and supportive in terms of your social structure, parents, friends, family, those kind of things, and really good coaching. And I'm sure we'll get into a discussion around what good coaching looks like and doesn't look like. I think that's probably one of the most important things to suss out. But then if you do that, and you start to get better, then you could have a look at, right, okay, what are the options and what does a potential next step look like? Because there's likely going to be more than one, and neither is any of them a given. And then figuring out what it actually going to take to get picked up or noticed by one of those, teams or organizations that are kind of like one step or the next step to where you want to get. And that you can quite simply do by, reaching out or checking in on things like Bridge the Gap, or asking coaches, asking former athletes, alumni, those that have kind of been there. It can seem a little bit opaque and challenging if you're in a club and you're looking up. It's like, oh, how do I get from here to to wherever I want to go, whether that's in North America or whether that's in Europe. But if you talk to somebody that has done it, and my experience is that people are very open in sharing what they're looking for or experiences and share some advice, you can kind of shine a bit of light on some of those key entry barriers or entry requirements. It's probably a better word than barriers. And that's probably the best thing to figure out, because then you get a goal that is on a relatively near-term horizon, and you can start working towards that. And as soon as you're in there, then you basically repeat the process. You You enhance your environment and your coaching and your training, and you get a little bit more sophisticated. And as you progress, you then say, okay, what's the next step? And you kind of do the same thing. So the information is out there, but it typically sits with people that have done it or work for those organizations rather than published sources. So a lot of it is about being curious and building relations, which if you want to go world tour or you want to make it to an Olympics or whatever the case may be, being proactive and being able to connect and be curious is a fundamental skill to build anyway. So yeah, it's a good thing to try and do and develop.
Let's move parents. So parents, obviously, especially now, like I think there's, people understand that the sport of cycling has shifted to being a bit of a younger developing sport from what it was sort of 8 or 9 years ago. So parents are much more implicated in their child's athlete journey. How have you guys, so you guys personally in Cycling Australia have just gone through a pretty extensive project with Chelsea to look at how you're looking at development in the country. And that also includes, material and information for parents and how the parents are more implicated in the young athlete's journey and what that looks like. Do you have any sort of guidance or advice for parents of young athletes to sort of help their child find that coherence and sort of navigate what can sometimes be, like you said, if it's an ecosystem, it's often not a clear step sequential set of things to go through. It's a disjointed or a fragmented set of things that the athlete, the parent, and the coach, or the program and the team need to piece together themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're talking about high performance parenting, there are definitely ways on how you can support and help guide and be well informed. But it may not necessarily be what parents expect it to be. So I'll start by saying what it's not. It's not pushing your kid to go and train more. It is not saying you need to perform at these races or you need to do X, Y, or Z, or get really upset if they don't, or get overly happy if they do. The best thing that you can do is help find a really good coach, first and foremost. Secondly, there's going to be ups and downs. There's a lot of differences in terms of how the rate at which athletes develop, which can have to do with their environment, but also their time in the sport, their biological age versus their chronological age, growth rates. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes into it. And the honest truth is you're never really going to know why somebody is progressing really quickly or not. So be supportive, be empathetic and non-judgmental. That is really important. And then the other thing is to help establish, you can call them high performance behaviors, but if you're talking about teenage developing athletes, it's basically around developing really good professional behaviors in terms of consistency in training, rather than looking at the outcome, talking about, hey, what have you done in terms of process and how are you managing that? Planning. It's like, okay, what can we do to help plan with your school? Because you're going to be training a fair bit. Help managing athletes, and in particular younger athletes. You can get one of two ways where they get a little bit overly casual, and in particular boys more so than girls, overly casual and not pay as much attention to the detail, or maybe do 80% of a training right rather than 100% of the training right. I'm sure you've got some experience with that, Kevin. And it is about consistency over time and building professional behaviors. At the end of the day, the vast majority does not make it to World Tour and Olympic team, and that is perfectly fine. But if you do those things, you will be a better professional in your social career, and you will be better equipped to deal with life, which is part of the power of sport. So rather than focusing on the race outcomes or the rate of progression, be empathetic, work on professional behavioral skills, check in on that, and be mindful of the development of your kid as a young adult rather than a bike racer. If you do those things, the racing will take care of itself.
That's great advice. And I really like that concept of any sport, whether it's cycling or anyone, can really help young people develop those transferable life skills that they can carry through to anything they subsequently do in life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, coaches and coaching. So that, another important thing that needs to be considered is, where and how the athletes train on a daily basis, their access to coaching, and the coach's role in helping athletes sort of navigate an ecosystem.
Yeah.
How do coaches help athletes and parents sort of see some of the coherence in what can be fragmented ecosystems?
Yeah. Well, let's start with a little bit of a definition linked to opinion, really. So call it my definition. I know it's shared with others as well, but a definition of coaching, or my personal belief on what coaching is or isn't. If you have a coach, you're seeing that person face to face multiple times a week. They're at your training sessions, they're at your racing, they help provide cues and feedback whilst you're doing it. And beyond the physical component, the technical components, the tactical components, and we can unpack what they are in a bit if you're keen, they also help develop you as a person, and they care as much around the environment around you to help unlock your potential as a human being, as it much around the other stuff. So if you have somebody that gives you a training program on Training Peaks or whatever platform you're on, and gives some advice around nutrition, and then goes, you need to sleep this much, or you need to train this much, and you need to do these efforts, but isn't with you consistently over time at training, at racing, and developing your life skills, developing your technical skills, developing your tactical skills as much as your physiology, you don't have a coach. You've got a trainer. And there's a difference between a trainer and a coach. And even up until the World Tour level, there is a misunderstanding of what world-class coaching look like. And they oftentimes call trainers or sports scientists, which can be incredibly good at what they do, coaches, but they're not coaching, and therefore shouldn't be called coaches. So what you ought to look for is somebody that actually does do those things face to face, because the more you can increase feedback loops and build confidence, trust, and belief, the faster you're going to progress. And that's going to be critically important, both for your progression or when things inevitably don't go as well or as planned. Having more and faster feedback loops helps develop you faster, helps you deal with things off the bike as well. So I think it's in conjunction with parenting, the single most important thing to think about, be mindful of, and make sure you get right.
Yeah, I have a question or comment. Maybe you've identified a bit of a challenge in Canada, because I like your differentiating with coaching and trainers, but as you know, we do live in a really big country, and there isn't coaching programs that exist in person across the country. So how would a person find that additional support if maybe that doesn't exist in their current
Yeah,
city or community?
that is a great question. So, first of all, depending on the level that you're at, if you're at a club, find clubs that have a good coach, because it starts local, and sometimes those coaches even carry on with you afterwards. If you can't, find remote coaching, even though it isn't as good. So remote coaching, I would describe as not necessarily just doing the dose response, as in the training schedule, but also videotaping sessions, having video calls like, this in like a one-on-one setting, and make sure that those other things are covered. And inevitably, it's never going to be perfect. So you're going to have some kind of a blend, potentially, or if you can't at all, get it remotely. But when you talk to people that would label themselves as private coaches, if you get to that level, have some good conversations around what are the services actually that they provide, how do they work, what are their workflows, what can you expect, what would they work on, and then you can kind of tease out the elements or the strengths that the coaches have and what the engagement might look like. And if it actually covers those areas that we just touched on, because the better you get, the more important they become.
And actually, yeah, so what advice would you give? We will probably have coaches also listening here, and for coaches who also want to improve what they're doing, what could they be offering that's a bit more for
Yeah.
their athletes to cover those things?
Well, so I think a really good coach is as curious as a really good athlete and has the same growth mindset and works perpetually on development as much as the athlete does. And therefore is constantly looking for new courses, new experiences, new people, new conversations to kind of grow themselves, to either stay contemporary or build out their toolkit. And I think it's really important upfront as a coach, around what your skill sets are, where you're really good at helping and not, because every coach has got a different set of strengths and development areas. And there's actually quite a bit of literature around the importance of both person environment fit and person job fit. So the type of job that you do is contextual on the environment in which you do it. In other way, the people around you that you work with. So somebody can be an exceptional coach for one athlete, but that style or toolkit, for example, might be great with Kevin, but it may not be a really great coach for you personally, Lee. And I'd actually be curious to ask you a question in what your experience was with that, because I'm sure over the course of your career, even at pro level, you would have had a number of different coaches who would work differently, bring different strengths. What was your experience as a rider in that?
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. And that's the same advice I'd give other riders. Like, you have to find a coach that fits with your personality, and they can be an amazing coach and have, a great resume, but that person might not be the best for you. So, yeah. And
Yeah.
sometimes, I mean, the challenge in the sport, um, sometimes you don't get to choose your coach or your trainer, especially at the highest level, which that's okay. That's part of being a professional. You learn to work with whoever your colleagues and your coaches. But yeah, when you do have the choice and say in the matter, then I think you can be selective, and it's okay to like interview coaches.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Excellent. Yeah. I think that resonates. And probably a word of advice for coaches, is have a think about, if you, and you can do this pretty much for any vocation or any role, is you can kind of cut it up in 4 quadrants, and you can go skills, knowledge, attitudes, behaviors. So you go, what are the actual skills that you'd need or like to have in order to become or be the coach that you'd like to be. In order to deploy those skills, what knowledge do I need? And where can I find that? Do I already have it? Am I really strong? You don't have to be good at everything, but how do you leverage
integrate
your
things?
Yeah, integrate, leverage your superpowers, but then also find like which development areas are really important for me to become the coach that I want to be. And then you got attitudes and behaviors, and I'll explain a little bit on what the difference between them is. An attitude is what you fundamentally believe to be true, but it may not be necessarily be visible. So that's your internal dialogue and your values. And behaviors are those things that you actually display and people pick up on. And those are really important around that person fit that Leah just talked to. And what Leah said as well holds true for us as well. Like sometimes you can pick the coach that you work with. And if you get a collection of people together, those attitudes and behaviors start to form as a collective, or a tapestry of them start to form your culture, your ways of working, or your identity as a team. So we've got one of those avatars, and we've made the conscious decision a couple of years ago to hire, fire, develop, and retain coaches exclusively on attitudes and behaviors. Because they are a lot harder once they're established to change. They're not fully fixed, but kind of. But then if we're saying that we're about people development and we want to, enable people to be the best versions of themselves, and we want to have a collective growth mindset, then you should also say that, skills and knowledge, you can develop that. You can go to courses, you can do immersions, you can get a mentor, you can do all those things, and your skills and knowledge will evolve. Of course, when you get to an Olympic level or world tour level, you got to have a certain level of skills and knowledge. So we definitely test for that. But we don't hire or fire for it. We hire and fire based on behaviors and attitudes.
That's super interesting. Because so you're not using sort of a certification or a certified expertise method of hiring coaches into the national program.
No, because we beyond a strategy, we developed like, okay, if that is our ambition, then how do we operate or need to operate to get there? And by virtue of that, you then collect a set of principles or values or virtues, however you want to call them. They're slightly different, but they're kind of the same. And that then downstreams into everything that you do and the decisions that you make, which includes the people that you bring on board, the people that you keep on board in your development processes. So it kind of starts from an ambition that then turns into, well, then if we want to get there, then what do we need to get done, and how do we need to behave in order to get there? And that then sets a couple of avatars, coach avatar being one of them. And so we're constantly talking about that and looking at it and developing, because if you don't, you can have people that are incredibly knowledgeable, but if they're a bit of a what, they could rip the team apart in no time, or quite frankly, do you want to go to work every day and go, it's like, oh, I got to deal with this idiot. Yeah, he's good at his job, but man, you don't want that. We don't want that. I don't want that. So yeah, no, attitudes and behaviors, really important.
Awesome. Maybe like stepping back a tiny bit to Leah's previous question, what's interesting about your background, Jesse, and your experiences, you've worked from within a very tiny country, the Netherlands, to two gigantic countries, Canada and Australia. So when Leah asked the question about how, Canadian athletes, cyclists have the challenge of the in-person coaching, which is very true. what are some things that you guys have done in Australia that you've now seen, or that you saw or experienced in Canada that can help to get the athlete and the coach together face to face more often, or just simply deal with that geographic challenge? And you've seen how it can work in a smaller country like the Netherlands, where proximity is very easy, and then you've seen how it works in to massive countries.
Yeah. Oh, geez. Yes. What I would say is I would preface it by saying we are a work in progress, Gif, in Australia as well. Absolutely. We are a work in progress. So if there's people that have got really good suggestions and experiences, all ears, because we need to continue to get better in that space. But and we are working on it. But some of the things that we do and that you might be able to take home is there's going to be travel and there's going to be tyranny of distance, and you're going to have to deal with time zones, which absolutely is a challenge. Equally, it's a given. So you can kind of moan about it. It's not going to change it. So, kind of suck it up and figure it out is the short and the short answer. But then if you take that into a bit of a more positive light, if your ambition is to get to World Tour or Olympic programming or both, or whatever the case may be, or mountain bike factory team, you're going to need those skills regardless, because you will be racing in Europe, you will be racing in North America, you will be racing in Australia or Southeast Asia. You will have to deal with your manager. You will have to deal with your support staff that may be a couple time zones away. You will have to manage travel and bike packing and long distances and long rides and long bus rides and all of the above. So in essence, you could say that the negative is a positive, because you get the opportunity to better refine those skills than some of the Europeans early on. And that kind of goes to, shifting from a complaining mindset to a bit of a challenge mindset, which I think is really important. So that's number one. How can you look at it's like, oh, it's a barrier, it's tough, just saying it's like, well, actually, no, it's not tough. It's a challenge, and it's an opportunity to develop a skill set that's going to be important for me regardless later on, later down the road. Then other things, what we're trying to do is we've got a number of academies that we manage. So we've got national team programming in two spots. So we've got what we call acceleration and action, which is your power-based sports, BMX race, BMX freestyle, track sprint, up in Brisbane/Gold Coast, so in Queensland, which is where I live, where the top of the sport is residential programming, really. There is no pro outlet. There's some for BMX freestyle, but it's a different kettle of fish. And then endurance is out of Adelaide in Europe mostly, which is track endurance, road, mountain bike. We try to cross over and merge as much as we possibly can. And then in all of the states bar one territory, we have what we call a state institute, which is basically a development program. So we've got one in Perth, we've got one in Adelaide, we've got one in Melbourne, we've got one in Sydney, we've got one in Tasmania, we've got one in Brisbane. And they do a lot of development programming for varying sports. Then on top of that, there is, I wouldn't say a rich, but there's relatively good continental level racing and teams in Australia. But the outlook there is a little bit more, rather than just Australia, because the distances are really, really large, same as in Canada and the US. It's actually more oriented to Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, with a European bloc typically. So finding a blend of regional and European. you don't necessarily have to do everything in Europe all the time. There can be really good, developmentally appropriate racing in your region. And finding a blend between the two is really important.
So I'm going to ask a kind of a direct question. Is one of the things that we, like whether it's Bridge the Gap or some of the other work that I'm doing in sport, in order to sort of tackle that geographic challenge, I think there's also a need to have good camps, so instead of just train at home, perhaps with a remote trainer or a remote coach, or using your local club, get together from time to time with your coach and other athletes and have really good focused training camps, or camps in projects. And that way you can sort of do your preparation in a focused and a deliberate way. It may not be permanent or full time, but it can be a little bit of that kind of semi-centralized model, or semi-decentralized, if you will. Do you think that's a good approach for athletes in countries like Canada or Australia or United States, where they may not have continuous access to the kind of daily training environment they might need given their age and stage?
I think camps at any level play a role, and if you do them well, a pretty important role. What doing them well is, that I'll touch on that in the second part, but my view on what a camp is and does is, camps done well are amplifiers. So they can expedite the development of a skill. They can expedite some knowledge development. They can, even if you go like really high level, they can expedite a preparation for a specific race, for example. If you do it well, and the literature describes it as a camp effect. So coming into a focus camp in a different environment than what you're in on your day-to-day, in particular if it's a nice and like a high arousing, so really good impulses for either, whether that would be really good coaching or coach instruction, or in a really nice environment, that can expedite learning or focus, and kind of amplifies or accelerates. It's not a substitute for a daily environment. It's also not a substitute for racing. It is a supplement, and if done well, an amplifier. And what do I mean by if done well? It is quite easy in a camp, in particular if you're a coach or an organizer, to try and put as much in as you possibly can, and kind of feel good about you getting as much out of your head towards the athletes as humanly possible. But that doesn't necessarily make a good camp, because what typically happens is, after 5 minutes, it goes in here and you can kind of see it come out that way, and they're checked out. So it's really being purposeful around, okay, what is the intent of the camp? What is the bandwidth of the athletes, both cognitively, physically? Is it more physiology based? Is it more skill based? Is it more knowledge based? And therefore, how do we deliberately structure that? Or if you get a little bit more advanced, right now we're in a staging camp, so we're really deliberate around what do these 2 weeks need to look like to have the athletes be the best version of themselves, which is very detailed. But it's only about that, nothing else. We're not doing, social skill development, or doing extra classes, or working on new skills, or sharing extra knowledge. It's just fine-tuning physiology and taper, getting some race tactics right. That's it. 2 weeks, full focus. Same if you're in a world where you do an altitude camp, like you're there to create a specific physiological adaptation. One goal, focused, targeted. A good camp is exactly that. If you try to fill it with as much activity and as much information as you possibly can, you're going to overcook it, and it's going to take a lot of resource, a lot of effort, and what the athletes effectively take away is probably relatively minimal.
That's good advice. That's good advice. So if we want to summarize that, I'd say it's treat camps like development amplifiers. Keep the focus very specific and narrow to just a few things. And do you think, especially more at sort of the development stage, because you just touched on a couple of things that were more sort of elite, top performance stage, do you think it is possible for, if you're working on some skills pieces or some knowledge pieces, in the context of a camp, to try to introduce them in a way that can lead to behavior change? So when we get back to your concept of avatars, is it possible in camps, because of the environment itself that a camp presents that's different than a competition environment, to actually sort of affect some behavior change for development athletes?
Yeah, 100%. And I would argue that the most important one at that, and that is fully in the control of the athletes and the coaches, is being really clear around what it is that you want to have achieved or developed at the end of your camp, and having specific process goals against that before you get into the camp, so that you can evaluate and keep learning and keep fine-tuning. If you go into a camp and you don't have a clear process goal or an end state before going in, you're not going to maximize your development or learning, whether that is behavioral, whether it is technical, whether that's physiological. Plus, otherwise, how else would a coach or an athlete or the organizer know that the camp was effective, yes or no, and or needs to, evolve it for the next one? So having like goal setting, even for like small blocks, incredibly important. And it's a skill. Goal setting is trainable. That's the great thing.
Awesome. So now I want to do a little bit of talk about, sort of when we talk about pathways, especially sort of step-based pathways, whether they're, sort of transitional or step-based. Ultimately, and you touched on it early on, and it's not everybody is going to progress to the next step, and that's totally okay. But how do pathways look at development around those concepts of conversion and readiness, so that athletes are going through a process and they're progressing? So some are going to keep progressing and progressing onto the next stages or zones or steps, and some may not. But how do pathways look at that process of development, conversion, and readiness?
Yeah. You got to treat them differently in two views. You got to take a program view or a team view, and you got to take an athlete view, because they're not necessarily the same. So if we start from a program view or a team view, you have two elements that are equally true. One, if you dive into talent development literature, you would find quite a bit information and publications proclaiming you need to keep as many athletes viable for as long as humanly possible, because talent prediction is highly inaccurate, as much as some people like to believe they're really good at it, but it is highly inaccurate. So you want to keep as many people viable or involved for as long as humanly possible, which negates what they call type 1 and type 2 selection errors. Type 1 basically
Sorry. Oh, sorry. You're going to explain it. I was going to ask you to explain that. I thought you might be jumping in.
Yeah. Yes. So type 1 and type 2 selection errors are basically saying false selection and false deselection. What are they? A false selection is basically you select somebody because they think they're going to do a certain performance or develop somewhere, but they don't. That's false selection. False deselection is a lot harder to ascertain if that happened, but it's basically deselecting somebody because you think they won't make it, but if they were given the opportunity, they actually would have. The earlier you make selections, the higher your rate of those two errors. So hence, philosophically, you want to keep as many people viable for as long as humanly possible. Now, there's another thing there from a team perspective. If you're a team, to develop people, it is not a quantity game, it is a quality game. And in order to maximize quality, you got to create the resource capacity in terms of coaching, racing, equipment, R&D, physiology, massage services, skill development, all those kind of things, which take resource and effort. That being time, people, money. And if you spread that out too wide or too thin, then nobody makes it because you can't offer the quality to actually progress them. So it's a bit of a paradox, and both are true. And if you're a team and you do well, you're highly aware of both and you're trying to like constantly debate them and move through it. If you're an athlete, that makes zero sense. You don't care. That's not your problem. But if we're talking about progression from an athlete perspective, what fundamentally holds true is one, if you do it well, there's a brilliant coach out of UCLA, coach basketball, 60s, 70s, maybe into the early 80s. Like I should know this, I actually don't. His name is John Wooden, most successful collegiate basketball coach of all time. And he was not satisfied with how the dictionary put the definition of success. And so he created his own. And if you go to UCLA, you can see a bunch of statues, and it's like at a lot of the classrooms, etc. And I might bastardize it a little bit, but in effect, it reads like success is peace of mind, which can only be achieved by knowing that you did your absolute best to become the best you're capable of becoming. Because you have both what you call in academic terms nurture, which is your social support, your coaching, the development around you, the races that you go to, your support structures. That is all developmental. But you also have nature. Some things are just genetic. You cannot change how tall you are or how short you are. You cannot change your muscle fiber type. And there's a couple of other things in your physiology as well that are just fixed. That means for some people, even if they do everything right and by the book, they won't get to the level that Leo was at. That's just the case. Does that mean you're not successful? No. If you followed every training session, you haven't taken a day off, you're mindful of your nutrition, you've given it your absolute best, and you reach your ceiling, that is success too. No, not success too, that is success. And I think, well, for me personally, I got a lot more admiration for somebody who gets absolutely everything out of it and makes it to like a national level, as opposed to somebody who might go to the Tour de France or the Olympics and genuinely had the potential to contest the podium and, finishes mid-pack and is kind of cool with it. I got more respect for the former than the latter, because in effect, they're the same.
Interesting.
One maximized potential, the other did not. And I think that's really important when you think about pathways and how to treat it.
Interesting. I'm going to get a little bit specific in that sort of readiness and progression area.
I
What
didn't
do you this
got down a bunny. Sorry, Kev.
no, it's okay.
Please help me out here.
It's awesome. It's awesome. What do successful systems understand specifically about the junior to U23 to elite transition or progression that weaker sort of systems often miss?
Yeah, that is a very simple one. With what a U17 or U19 athlete needs in terms of skill development, how details matter, is a lot less sophisticated. It's still important, but it's less nuanced. So if you do your training consistency right, if you've got some decent coaches, if you can do some camps and competitions, generally what you'd see is that athletes progress pretty well, and you always have an X amount of juniors that are at the level. In the U23 stage, there's a really big transition where nuance and detail really start to matter. And then it's not just about if you're looking at developing speed and physiology, for example. If you get training volume, training distribution, and training density somewhat right, and you get some good coaching and racing, that's probably spot on if you're at U17, U19. In U23, however, in particular where the World Tour teams are at now and the top Olympic nations are at now, there is so much detail and nuance around aerodynamics, nutrition, sleep, recovery optimization, or what you can call first principles modeling, which is basically the physics around a race and race strategy and pacing strategy, and making sure that your aero and your nutrition and your race execution and your all link into that. And it's required to move from that end of U19 into like proper World Tour at the moment, or really contest medals at the Olympics. And if you don't have that IP and that knowledge layer around you at that stage, you're just not going to get there. Just to give a really simple example from a physics perspective. Now in a road race, it's a little bit different, but if you get to top time trialing, 1% drag reduction for a time trialer is about the same as 0.7% power improvement. So if you can say you can increase your aero by 10%, that's the same as increasing your average power by 7%, give or take, in a time trial. That is, let's say hypothetically you do 400 watts in a time trial on average. That is about 28 watts difference. To train to get 28 watts stronger at average at that level is really hard, if not impossible. And that distribution gets more skewed the faster you go. So in track cycling, and especially track sprints, or if you're looking at team pursuit and track sprint, it's literally one-on-one. A 1% decrease in drag is equal to a 1% improvement in power. And then, other things around, managing weight, managing your race strategy, managing your race fueling and preloading and tapering and all those kind of things. There's a lot of sophistication around it. And so what you typically see is those teams and nations that have that IP, they convert a lot more athletes, where teams and nations that don't, they kind of get stuck and don't really progress much after U19, early U23.
Okay, let's kind of tie that off a little bit cleanly. So when we get to that, what are the things that sort of let's call them systems that under convert or under progress their athletes. What might they be missing? And it's in the details of the planning and the execution that are truly required at the top international levels of the sport. So it's in that intellectual property and the planning and the preparation and the execution that happens around the athletes to bring them to those levels of competitions. And
yeah, and the two primary ones are aerodynamics and nutrition.
okay, I'm going to ask another one in here. This is actually another sort of practical one for athletes and coaches. How should an athlete interpret a shock experience? So especially, sort of athletes from countries that are sort of like non-European in the sport of cycling, like Australia or Canada or United States. We have athletes that'll go to Europe and kind of be shocked by what they experience. And that can be a deflating or demoralizing experience. So how do athletes and coaches, should they do those things in the first place? How do they deal with them when they happen? Like, what kind of practical advice can there be for athletes that are sort of, and maybe they take a big bite a little bit too soon, or a bigger bite than they think. Maybe they're actually ready for that big bite, but it shocks them nonetheless when they get a taste of it.
Yeah, so I think first, going back to that planning and coaching piece, look at your year from a racing and a camp's perspective. And as a bit of a principle, the fastest way you're going to develop through your racing is if you race about 60% of your races or race days against peers in a somewhat challenging, but kind of at a slightly comfortable / uncomfortable level. 20% of your race days where you'd quote unquote play down. And I know you and I talked a lot about this, Kevin. And playing down is effectively going races where you're expected to win or you're expected to be the leader because you're just a little bit better or a little bit older or a little bit stronger or have a little bit more skill. And the reason why that is important is because you learn how to race differently. You learn how to deal with pressure. You learn how to execute at the back end or the pointy end of a race when everybody's marking you instead of the other way around. So you develop different skills from a leadership and a racing perspective, and also with pressure and expectation because everybody's looking at you to win. Right, so that's playing down. Equally, that gets us to 80%, so we got 20% left. 20% should be playing up, which is going to races where basically you feel like you get your teeth kicked in. But that's important too, because that's where you feel and experience what the speed is like, how tight a bunch might be, how technical, how fast it is. And you can talk about that until the cows come home, but until you experience it, it's really hard to bring it to life. So it starts with planning, and you shouldn't do 50 or 80% of your races where you play up. That's number one. So one, make sure that you get the right dose. Secondly, break it down and train for it. If you know you're going to Belgium, you can say, well, what do we know about Belgium or the Netherlands? Well, you're going to be in a race, and rather than 20 or 30, there's going to be 130. And the roads are about half the width. So train for it. Camp, training session, get cones out, make the road narrower, go to a crit course, go to whatever, make it narrower, get some people around you. Do bump drills, but do cornering and bump drills, not for the sake of cornering or bumping, make it specific. In other words, what I mean by specificity, again, going to that example, if you go into Belgium or the Netherlands, which most of that age group would go to race, to kermesses or local races or nation cups, etc. One, learn how to move through a bunch and work on setups at about 40 to 45 kilometers an hour. It's all fun and games if you can do it at 30, but can you do it at 45 and make sure that you position yourself before the corner starts rather than when you see the corner? So there's a bit around scoping, around course familiarity and recon, which you can train back home. There's a bit of skill training, which you can train at home. And also train on different road surfaces, because it might be rough and you may be going from concrete to cobbles to gravel back on, so learn the feel of the bike, learn grip, learn it at that speed, and all those things you could do at home. So long story short, do your homework, and then if you get stretched, it's fine, you learn. That would be my advice.
Oh, that's great advice. And maybe just to sort of, again, kind of package that up. So it's, if you plan your races throughout the season inside those three little groups, you know in advance as the athlete or the coach that you're going into a race that's going to maybe be playing up, or not maybe, it is playing up. So you actually are sort of pre-prepared for understanding that it could be a bit of a shocker. And then when it is a shocker, you can take that information and those experiences back and process them much better.
Yeah, absolutely. And what has changed, though, is that there is a bit of an urgency to do that earlier now and go to Europe earlier, because most of the World Tour teams now have World Tour development teams, and rather than looking at 24-year-olds, they're looking at 19-year-olds. But what I would say, don't get distracted by that. Focus on you, control your controllables, and work on your own physiology and skill level. And when you're good enough, you'll get picked up regardless.
Yes. You said another really important thing in there. And I would call it specific practice. So if you know so research the play up races that you're going to put yourself into and understand what you're getting into. And as much as possible, adapt your home-based training environment in advance, so you're practicing some of those skills or experiencing, at least in a training context, something close to what you're going to experience in the play up zone. And I think it's possible to do that, like you can, if you have to deal with large bunches that are sort of close quarters or more aggressive, you can go to specific races where, and it's going to be critical for you to reposition or learn how to position. You can go to particular races where you can get a little bit more of that compact racing experience, but then just move through a little bit more. Do some deliberate practice around the types of skills you're going to need when you go to those play up events.
Yes, and try to break that down as specifically as you can, because the more detailed or richer you can simulate a skill, whether that is in a training environment or a racing environment or a playing environment, because you can do that with games as well, the faster you develop that skill. If you just say, it's like, oh yeah, we're going to Belgium and cornering is going to be important, and you just go and you ride around a couple of corners, it's not going to do anything. It's at speed, under pressure, doing in training, find ways in racing. You may pick a couple of races that you say, it's like, well, I'm not going to try and win it or do a breakaway, but I'm going to deliberately put myself in the middle of a bunch and see if I can move through, and then drop back and just take a particular skill. So you can pick your races for development and you can pick your races for the performance. So within that 60%, you should also think of, where do I want to practice or train something, and I don't care as much about the outcome, I just want to get the reps in, and where do I actually want to get a result or perform? They're not the same. Don't just go into a race to go into a race. Be deliberate. Like, kind of going back to that first planning bit, I'm a big fan of looking at a year or multiple years rather than a short block into a race. So rather than saying how many efforts or blocks that you do this week and how much in this zone, how much in that, it's like, let's start with how many hours of training that you do over the course of a year. Because if you want to get to pro, you're going to be able to do anywhere between 900 and 1,050 hours a year amongst training and racing. And you can only develop that at a certain pace. And you can only build the physiology if the limited rate, one of them are your mitochondria, which is basically taking oxygen into your muscles. And that takes a lot of volume and years to develop. So you can kind of, so it's like, well, if I want to get to that volume, what do I do? How much volume do I do? Secondly, in that, you kind of want to go 90% of that volume really easy or below your first lactate turn point, zone 1, zone 2, however you want to call it, and 10% above, but you're going to get most of the 10% from racing. So there's a bit around physiology, being deliberate about that, looking at the year, but also then looking at the skill and your racing as an actual development tour for a whole year, rather than just going into the next race, try to win it, going into the next race, try to win it. Long-winded answer, but I think it's critically important.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, so Jesse, thinking of skill development at home, I was curious on your opinion on the role that multi-discipline can play, since I think one challenge in Canada as well is certain areas have a lack of racing, road racing specifically. So multi-discipline, and then maybe even for the younger ages, like so U17, there's a lot of multi-sport participation. So maybe you could touch on both of those topics.
Yeah, it's a great question, Leah. I'll take both and I'll add one, because you basically get development, then you get those call them that U17, U19, U23 group. We call that progress, and then actually at perform, well, like at the pinnacle end, there's also a lot to say about it for the actual elites, even if you're a world tour in an Olympic program. Looked at this a lot, and it was what my PhD dissertation was on, and basically asking the questions like, well, it seems like there are quite a few top riders at the World Tour and the Olympics that do well on the road and well in mountain bike, or do well on the road and well on the track, or cyclocross. We can all list them off, from your Lotte Kopecki's to your Chloe Dygerts to your Geraint Thomases, to your, like, the list goes on and on. Mathieu Van der Poel, Tom Pidcock, you just can go on for ages. So looked at that and looked at, from a developmental perspective, taking all those super champions, like, are you more likely to become one if you specialize just in road or track or mountain bike? Or does your probability improve if you do that? And is there then a difference in which stage you do that? Because there was a lot of ingrained belief that in particular at the pinnacle end, you need to specialize. Now, if we start at the bottom of, I call it the bottom of the pathway, or your younger developmental years, so call it your early teens, if you will, most part, you should just have fun and develop your general movement skills, which is to say, yeah, sure, if you're on your bike, go and cycle, but play basketball, play volleyball, play soccer, go cross-country skiing, do different things, develop your movement competency, just have fun. Then, as you progress, there is a large body of literature on what is called constraint-based approaches to learning. Now, that's a mouthful, but basically what it means is you can do, you got person constraints, which is the athlete. So you can say, well, I want you to do pedaling, but I only want you to do it with one leg, right? So you constrain the person to develop a skill. You can also manipulate the task, so you can make the task harder, like we just talked about with cornering. Do it faster, make the road narrower. So you provide a constraint to the task. And you can also provide a constraint to the environment. So you say, do this skill. Now do it on grass. Now do it on gravel. And constraint-based approaches to learning have been proven to expedite or speed up skill development. Now, what is really interesting is even at the elite level, those that combine and cross over perform better on aggregate than those that specialize. So if you're on the road and you're an elite athlete and you supplement it with track or you supplement it with mountain bike, your road actually gets better. The why to that is a little bit more opaque, but if we're looking at the literature, there are two reasons as to why that may be the case. One, you get better if you train and race more. That's a bit kicking in an open door, but training consistency, training volume is a thing. But in particular, if you get towards the pointy end and get to like World Tour development or World Tour, what you see a lot are overuse injuries or burnout because of the repetitiveness of your training, your activity, etc. So if you change the environment for that, what tends to happen is that those burnout injuries or kind of getting stale mentally because you're in different environments doing slightly different things, that progresses. So you miss fewer days, therefore you train and race more over time, and over the years you become better than somebody else that specializes. The second reason is because you actually keep honing those skills. And even though people might say mountain bike is very different to road, and road is very different to mountain bike, and road is very different to track, it's actually not, if you look at from a skill perspective. So those are the reasons why. So long story short, can you get to where you want to get to, wherever that may be, by specializing in cycling only and picking one discipline? Yes, absolutely. Can you do it by doing multidiscipline? Yes, absolutely. You don't need to specialize no matter which level you are. Matter of factly, if you got the opportunity to, you're better off doing multidiscipline. And that can even include cross-country skiing or speed skating if you're in Canada, because you train the same energy systems around the same kinetic chain, which is basically the sequence of muscles that you use for your movement. So you can get more training done, you can stay fresh, you develop more skill. Long story short, you can do either specialize or do a multidiscipline. But my strong recommendation would be, if you have the opportunity, go multidiscipline, no matter which level you're at.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And yeah, I can speak from my own experience growing up too. I think that was absolutely helpful, both being multidiscipline and then multi-sport with cross-country skiing. And I think that it did help avoid a lot of burnout and just having like, you're actually outside in the winter and you're actually developing muscles, that you need cycling, but you don't build on the bike. It's
Yeah.
It can be really complementary. Yeah.
Plus, do you really want to be in a basement doing Swifting? Well, sorry, I shouldn't. But be on the train in a
No, but it's
basement
all
for
in a
3
balance.
months,
I think it's in a balance. Yeah, you still got to go outside sometimes too, just
bang
for
your
your.
head against the wall, or would you rather be outside? And yeah. Anyways, yeah, a great example there, Leah. Like lived experience.
Mhm.
I enjoyed digging into that research when we were doing the work we did back, it was like 6-7 years ago, Jesse. It was really revealing for me, and it really did fundamentally change how I look at developing cyclists, especially using that multidiscipline approach. So we're gonna wrap it up. I'm gonna finish with some questions. We've kind of been through an interesting sort of arc here where we talked about define what a pathway is, help athletes, parents, or coaches understand if they're functioning inside of a coherent one, and the kind of things they need to look at to determine that. Then we got into some specifics of training environments and coaching. I'm going to now bring it back to a system level and talk about what role federations or sport organizations play in pathways. So I'm going to ask you, what is the proper role a federation or a sport organization today needs to play? Is it as an architect of pathways or environments, a steward of environments, a connector within the ecosystem, or something else?
Yeah. I got a sneaking suspicion that my answer won't please many people. But if you're looking at it, a national federation has two clients. Depending on how it's structured, it's either member or clubs and the federal government, typically. Because federal governments, through events, grants, high performance funding, typically contribute a significant part of the budget of an NSO. So on the basis of the clubs and members is providing value for their experiences, and that typically translates into some level of club support, some level of events and activities or hosting grants. Could be through, like in Canada, more regional delivery in the provincial and territorial sporting organizations rather than the national federation. So that is one, and therefore they're kind of stewarding the ecosystem. But it's not necessarily the mandate or a requirement of an NSO to have a structured pathway. Because if we're talking about pathways in the context of this discussion, we're really talking about high performance development. And if we're being completely honest, for most federations, including the one that I work for, 100% of that is through federal government funding. There is no membership contribution that goes to high performance programming, whether it's pathways or elite delivery. And you got to be really mindful about that, because that is purposeful taxpayer money that you're receiving against a particular goal or national objective. And in Australia, same way as in Canada, that is exclusively to try and get medals at the Olympic Games. The organization that does that in Canada even put that in their name, Own the Podium. So depending on the level of funding that you have, the most important thing is, and there is a bit of a balance between the upcoming games and future games. So there's a sustainability piece to it, but is actually to create programs and projects around those that can genuinely medal and do that at a level to enable them to medal at Olympic and Paralympic Games. Now, the sustainability part of that would also say, it's like, well, then what is your distribution of those resources towards those that might be able to do it in the future versus those that can do it now? So that's a strategy and a leadership question. But an NSO does not have an obligation to have a structured pathway, but they do have the obligation to steward the ecosystem. That is a bit of political strategical answer, but that's the fact of the matter. And if you do that well, you can be really articulate into what you fund, what you support. And so there's influencing in enabling the ecosystem, so you can influence, or you can, the things that you do yourself, you control. And you got to be deliberate around what you influence, what you control. You got to be deliberate around what the objectives are, and therefore which programs, projects, etc. you do and don't do, and why, and do that of a really clear structured plan. So yeah, the answer is there is no obligation to have a pathway as an NSO, but there is an obligation to try and represent Canada at the highest level and contest medals. Same for Australia. And then the next question is, how do you do that sustainable? So, and that then trickles down to questions like, well, do we have the resource to build our own pathway, or are we better off partnering and influencing? And that can be different for different countries. I can only speak to my own experience in Australia. But yeah, that's the role of a federation.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to actually ask you to ask yourself one final question. So if there's something that we haven't talked about today, a question that we haven't asked that you think needs to be asked, what is it, and how would you answer it?
Good question. Good question. Good question. Good question. I think what I would say is, what is important to develop for our audience from an athlete perspective. Coaches can think about it, athletes can think about it. And you tend to have this prerogative around skills and tactics and getting muddied up. And also, it's all about skills. We got to be very skilled. Is that actually the case? And if you want to progress, what is being looked at? I think that is a great question from being mindful of the audience that we didn't really touch on. So, and I kind of stole the analogy, but then I stole the analogy from you, Kev, because I know you shared that 10 years ago, and plagiarism form of flattery, so I stole that from you. But then did the explanation a little bit differently, and it evolved a little bit differently over the years. First of all, speed is the most important thing. And speed is propulsion, or physiology, minus resistance, i.e. drag. You can have all the skill that you want, but if you don't have the speed, you will never be in the race. Same as playing a poker game. You can have the best cards, you can know how to play an opponent, but if you don't have the chips to pay the ante, you're not in the game. So make sure you build speed, which is your physiology and your drag. Do that first. Really important. Second thing, technical and tactical skill get intertwined. Technical skill is maybe better viewed and thought of motor skill. So how does your body actually move, and how do you develop that? And how do you move with your bike? So bike body interaction, moving through a pack. That's technical skill. You can call it motor skill. And then you got tactical skill. Now, tactical skill, it can get a lot fuzzy. You can get to 100 different outcomes from a bike racing perspective. But really, if you're looking at skill acquisition, all tactical skill boils down to 4 cognitive skills. And they are situational awareness, which is highly trainable. Are you aware which situation you're in? Where's the race at? How far advanced is it? Do we have people up the road or not? Blah, blah, blah. Situational awareness. Or to the previous point, like, is there a critical turn or narrowing of the road coming up, and do I need to move up? So that's 1. 2, spatial awareness. Where are you in space? Do you have a lot of people around you? How far is it to the front? How far is it to the back? How much room do you actually have to move or not? Can you put your bike through a narrow thing? Spatial awareness. So you got situational awareness, spatial awareness, and then you've got, you can call it contextual awareness, where you can say, it's called pattern recognition, basically, which is to say, if you see certain movement patterns around you, can you recognize what that means? So can you recognize how the bunch moves when it speeds up or goes to a setup point? Can you see what people do if they set up an attack? Can you see how a bunch starts to form when a break starts to form? Those are all patterns that are trainable through video, through racing, through debriefing. So if you say you got pattern recognition, situational awareness, and spatial awareness. Those three, if you do them well, then combined to the fourth cognitive skill, which is decision making. And all of your tactics, you can break down to those four, and they're highly, highly trainable, not just in racing, but through video, training sessions, etc. Thanks. I never been asked to ask myself a question and then answer it. That was kind of weird. That made sense.
Well, Jesse, I did give you like 58 different questions that we could potentially talk about today, so you did have some choice in there. No, but I actually think you put something on the table that's even better than some of the questions we had sort of written down. And obviously, everything you just said there around those four cognitive abilities really kind of like hits home for me and for us at Bridge the Gap. And Lee, I think a lot of that kind of links back like to the road captain course we did a few years ago, where we brought some people in and we did a little camp where we were actually doing some sort of deliberate learning and exploring about what is the nature of a road captain in road cycling. And one of the questions we asked in the very first session was, do people think that being a good road captain is sort of a trait that people inherently have and it can't be learned or developed? Or do they think it's a set of skills that can actually be trained and improved and get better over time? And at the beginning of the course, everyone put up their hand and said that a road captain is something intuitive that you're born with, and it's something that's trait-based. And by the end, we asked the same question, and everybody had just fundamentally shifted to the other side, and they saw it as a role within cycling that is very skills-based, that can be trained and developed and progressed. So I thought that was a really great way to tie back to those four skills that you just mentioned at the end, which I think is awesome. Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, Jesse. It was a pleasure. We're going to be posting this to Bridge the Gap YouTube channel for everybody to watch and listen. And then we're going to be following up with you on August 9th, where we'll open up the Q&A to everybody who joins in, who wants to ask more questions to you about anything or pathways specifically.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Leah. And looking forward to the Q&A. That sounds like a bunch of fun.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.